Yep, I am.
Sweet, sweet. So, I think everyone knows the rules of the tournament, so I don't have to say much. Just that it's a trolley problem debate, and for this round, Cam's defending that you should pull the lever, and Spaz is taking the position that you should not pull the lever. And they'll both have a time cap of 50 minutes to decide. If there's no concession, then it will be decided upon the popular vote of the audience who is here for 75% of the debate. And thanks for debating, guys. Really appreciate it. You can get into it.
Okay. Do you mind if I go ahead and go first?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Okay. So the trolley problem, of course, is a classic ethics problem where we're given a situation where we have a trolley headed towards 5 people who it's going to kill. We can save those 5 people by flipping a switch and causing the trolley to change tracks, and as a result, kill one other innocent person. When people are asked about the trolley problem, responses are typically fairly divided. It's used as a sort of sorter most of the time between utilitarians and deontologists, with utilitarians taking the view that the moral thing to do is to flip the switch because it causes the lowest number of deaths, whereas deontologists typically take the view that because there's an asymmetry between killing and allowing someone to die, that the moral course of action is not to flip the switch, not to kill the person. While responses to the trolley problem are typically fairly divided, I think that once we start talking about other problems that should be equivalent, especially on a utilitarian view, the most famous one I think is the fat man problem, which is similar to the trolley problem, except instead of flipping a switch, we have to actually push a man in front of the tracks. Almost nobody is willing to take the supposedly utilitarian route towards these other problems. I think that most of the time when we talk about what makes an action moral, one of the necessary conditions for something being moral is its ability to be universalized somehow, or its ability to act as a general rule that can guide the actions of moral people in a society. I don't think that, even from some of the more enlightened utilitarian views like rule utilitarianism, that the sort of person who flips the switch in the trolley problem, which is effectively taking the lives of others directly into your own hands, is compatible with a functioning or with a moral society, frankly. For example, it's almost never accepted in our society that we have the right to make these sort of utilitarian decisions for others. We could, if we thought in a way that the person who wants to flip the switch in the trolley problem thinks. For instance, when somebody goes to a hospital, anytime we put them under, we could harvest all their organs and give them to people who are more in need of them than they are, which would surely be a utilitarian benefit, but isn't any way to run a society in the long run, and isn't moral fundamentally because it's effectively murder. I don't think that I can see any reason why murdering somebody by changing the direction of a trolley should be more ethical than murdering them by pushing them in front of a track or by harvesting their organs or any of the other ways that people would possibly have to make supposedly justified killings. And for that reason, I am against the I'm against flipping the switch on the trolley problem. And that'll conclude my opening statement.
Okay, thank you. And now I will defend that the position that you should pull the lever on the trolley problem. So I will start by saying, bringing up the difference between the trolley problem and the fat man problem is actually quite interesting, because the natural conceptualization of those two different scenarios are what leads us to make our decision. One of them is a more physical, direct inflicting of death on another human being, whereas the other one is more detached. And largely the reason why we view these things as different is because of the way that our society has led us to think about harming another human physically. When something is more direct, we subjectively view it as more harmful. It's much more negative to view someone dying in front of you than to hear a statistic about someone, thousands dying in warfare, for example. I would argue that this is precisely why preserving the maximum number of people possible is better. Because the fact that we think about those things in this way is the product of members of our own society determining what is moral, what should be done, and what should be preserved. The case of preserving a human life is unique in morality because humans assist us in determining what is moral, whether it's in legal cases or philosophical discussions. And due to that, I believe that the position of rule utilitarianism is less applicable to cases involving human death than act utilitarianism, because death warrants exceptions in many cases. Acting directly on ideals is gratifying. It is a positive thing for us to have a rule set on how to act in our society that is applicable to all areas. However, in the case of when human beings are damaged, keeping in mind cases, for example, of executing someone for murder are still in order to protect or to serve as many humans as possible, are ones in which ideals should be taken exception to. In short, a human should never be killed purely for the sake of an ideal, unless it is to protect a greater number of humans. I believe that this is something you can see laying the foundation of the legal system, laying the foundation of warfare, and etc. This isn't saying that morals should be relative or used however we like. Rather, in an honest pursuit of truth, efficiency, ideal, or understanding, more humans is simply better. Humans are the ones who help us find out what should be done in each situation, and help us to sort of pick apart retroactively what has already happened. So, to put this into play in the example itself, you and I are discussing now whether it's right or wrong to pull the lever for the purpose of persuasion. That's what we are aiming to do here. But one of the people that we killed on the train tracks might have had points that would have convinced us one way or the other. If we destroy their ability to communicate with us by allowing them to die, it's possible that the most convincing points or the most pertinent points might be lost. One of those people might have been a philosopher, one of them might have been a legal judge. And because of that, putting aside the basic value of saving a greater number of people, even in terms of ideals or what should set a precedent for the continuation of the society, the preservation of human lives is probably the most important thing. And that is my opening statement.
All right, cool. Thank you. So you started off by talking about the difference between the fat man problem and the trolley problem being the difference between a detached killing and a direct killing. I definitely agree with that, but I think as a utilitarian, you would have to agree that the difference in judgment here is an irrational one. It doesn't make any difference to the person being killed, to their family, to their friends, whether or not the killer looked them in the eye or whether or not they dispassionately flipped a switch. So from a utilitarian perspective, at least, we have to see the difference in decision here as being an irrational one. Another point you made was that you think that even if rule utilitarianism or generally rule-focused moral systems might be better for other situations, we should be willing to make exceptions here in the case of human life? And I would have to disagree with that pretty strongly as well. I don't think that, well, actually, I think that the most important rules that we have are going to be the rules that govern the way we make decisions about human life and death. There's a reason why laws are going to be enforced more strongly when major death and injury occurs. A rule that is thrown aside in a case of life or death situations just isn't really much of a rule at all.
I would like to clarify that I do not believe that rules should be pushed aside in any situation involving death. I simply believe that because humans are the ones who establish rules, in a situation where a rule would result in a greater number of deaths, it should be lifted in that situation, unless it would directly lead to an even greater number of deaths if it weren't. And I think that this is it's something that's less applicable to everyday life because it's not a scenario you see as often. But I think that should be the epistemology of the rules that we use.
Okay, so then on your view, it seems like you're going to be committed to saying that even in some of the even more controversial situations, like let's say that I have a doctor who receives a patient that has organs that they could unethically transplant into other patients. You would say that it's ethical or moral for that doctor to basically kill his patient and harvest their organs for the sake of others.
No, but the reason for that is that it would create a knock-on effect, such that it would set precedent for future actions in the society in which a greater number of people were killed in order to serve what would ultimately become a smaller number of people. And I believe that when we use a logic in which we are trying to preserve as many human lives as possible, we generally do stay away from the more vulgar depictions of the sacrifice of one person for the greater because it is ultimately harmful. However, in cases where it's exclusive or where the death of one person is preserving a greater number of people and would not be considered something chipping away at another ideal in place to protect humans, for example, that people should own their organs.
Okay.
Yeah.
If I could stop you. So,
Yeah.
on your view, you're appealing to sort of broader consequences. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, just like how we consider the Trolley problem in a vacuum, let's say that we're considering the killer doctor problem in a vacuum also.
If we're considering it in a vacuum, and the doctor would save more than one person by transplanting the organs, I suppose that in that case, it would be considered a morally correct thing to do. But this is precisely why we shouldn't consider such problems in a vacuum, because ultimately, philosophy is for the purpose of sort of dictating how we live our lives.
Okay.
I don't know.
Well, so if you don't think we should consider these problems in a vacuum, I don't think you could justify considering the classical trolley problem even in a vacuum. Like, if you want to respond to if you want to respond to the doctor scenario by talking about knock-on effects, I could just as easily say that if I flip the switch, it's going to create a knock-on effect that makes people afraid to work on train tracks, and now all our train tracks are in disrepair, and our trains are like derailing and killing even more people.
You can say that, but that's assuming that, I'm just sort of coming up with the knock-on effects randomly. I think that if you look at cases in which the organs of innocent people are harvested in order to be sold, for example, the case of monks in China, that was something that was happening in real life. It's created more trouble than it's worth, and if that were to become the tone of the society, it would fall into utter disrepair. I don't believe that deaths on train tracks dissuade people from working on train tracks. It's not like it would be a common thing. It's obviously a rare situation for a real life trolley problem to play out. But I mean, even in the cases of, for example, if someone is, on a rampage killing people, and even the prospect of them killing 2 people or 1 person is enough for us to shoot them and use lethal force. That's
Yeah, well, so when we have that conversation, most people would also appeal to the guilt versus innocence of the person who's like a mass shooter. And we could, if we wanted to, keep arguing about the hypothetical, but I think when you appeal to act utilitarianism to the extent that you're saying that it's okay for doctors to kill their patients and harvest their organs, I think that's where you leave me, and that's where you're going to leave the vast, vast majority of people behind. I think that most people have some kind of a view, and myself included, that there's, for example, that there's a difference between allowing someone to die naturally and between actively killing them. There's a difference between violating a position of trust versus fulfilling your duties and just being unable to save somebody. And I don't see any reason why.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
You go. Oh, okay. What I need to
No,
reiterate is that I do not consider that act utilitarianism should be used in every case, and I agreed that the idea of a doctor doing that to his patient in real life is grisly, but it is precisely because of the sort of gritty, complicated knock-on effects that do occur in the real world that this is and should be considered such a grisly thing. I think that ultimately, when it comes to actor rule utilitarianism, exceptions in rule utilitarianism should only be used. We should only default to act utilitarianism in cases where the very people who are determining what is moral or discussing what is moral would be killed. Because, that is the worst knock-on effect, is if we run out of humans in the society in the first place, where are we going to be then? So preserving human life should have rules around it.
So could you elaborate a little bit more on that last statement?
The fact is that when you choose to allow 5 people to die for the sake of the morality of defending 1 person, simply because the action that you would be taking would be considered amoral according to a rule, or immoral, the situation is that what you've done there is you've sacrificed 4 people for the sake of an ideal, even though those people may have been the ones who came up with the ideal, or may have been the ones who evolved the ideal in the future. The worst knock-on effect for a human or for human society is the loss of humans, because then we can no longer discuss what is moral or immoral. We can't form legal systems. We can't build train tracks. It's the worst kind of degeneration of our world, because all of us are humans, and all of us look at the world in a human way, from a human perspective.
Okay. I don't think that it's likely. I think, given the overall considerations, the possibility that one of the 5 people dying on the train tracks would have invented a new moral philosophy is not one of the ones that I would consider. I think, for the most part, when we talk about saving people's lives, we're talking about the value that people have, like, to themselves, to their families, to their friends, stuff like that. So with respect to your point about how act utilitarianism is only useful in a very few situations, the problem I have with that is I think it's dangerously close to saying that act utilitarianism is the system we should use when talking about moral hypotheticals, and otherwise we shouldn't use it. Because in almost every real world situation, we're not going to have these sort of vacuum situations, right? We're not going to have a universe consisting of only 5 people on one side of a track and 1 person on the other side. There's always going to be some further effects to consider, and there's always going to be the question of social precedent.
There is.
I think that having.
Sorry, you can go.
I think that having a moral system that is only able to be used in a very small fraction at that of moral hypotheticals is counterproductive. I think most of the time when we talk about these sort of hypothetical situations, we're supposed to be talking about them as if they were real, and we're supposed to be using them to generate rules that we can use in the real world for real decision making. I think that it would be disastrous for some of the reasons that I've already said to try to universalize the rule of flipping the switch.
I agree. I fully agree. But what I need to point out is the fact that when we have a philosophical discussion, we are doing 2 things. And this is why philosophy is a sort of multi-layered field. Because firstly, we are trying to determine how people should act in everyday life. But we're also trying to preserve epistemology. We're trying to preserve and critique the very logic that has formed the foundation of what we take as a given in how we live our lives. And because of that, I believe that while act utilitarianism isn't something solely confined to hypotheticals, it should be a force in our society, even if rule utilitarianism is used in most cases. And that is exactly because when you're doing something that violates the basic epistemology of your field, or of your ideal or of your moral, what you're doing is you're basically failing to accomplish the goal of that field, or failing to allow that field to create the good effects in everyday life that it should be creating. So while I agree that it's unlikely that one of those people would have been, a lawyer or philosopher, they don't need to start a whole field, but they can simply contribute. But yes, they probably aren't going to be doing that. However, if you say that the gamble is worth it because it is unlikely that those people as individuals would contribute, provide something new or advance fields, it's extremely negative in the sense that you're saying we already have enough humans, we already have things established, and it's unlikely that they're going to change. And that is almost destructive. I'm not saying this is your position, but if you take the implication of such a statement, it's that even this kind of discussion doesn't have much of a point to it, and we've already established how things are. It's almost anti-progressive. And so the idea is that whatever the moral or emotional implications of making a tough decision to preserve human life are, humans are the ones who will allow us to overcome the emotional harm, allow us to make sense of it retroactively, allow us to determine what is better to do next time. And when you're sacrificing that on the altar of some kind of ideal, that is when you are missing the epistemological basis of morality itself, which is in order to make the world as good a place as possible, or make the world as human friendly a place as possible.
So one thing that might be interesting to explore is you've talked a few times about the idea that there are some cases where we should rely on sort of this utilitarian moral calculus, and other cases where we shouldn't. Would you mind elaborating a little bit more on how you would make that distinction?
I would make the distinction based on whether the situation is violating the basis of morality, which is human life or human thinking. And ultimately, I believe that morality is based on human thinking, even if we think that we should gauge it by something else, such as religion or such as naturalism or any other.
But so we have like, so if I could stop you, we have lives at stake all the time in society, and we don't typically take that as a reason to discard our moral rules.
We don't, but I believe that is due to the fact that sometimes it's just easier to cling to the moral rules as opposed to do something that would face us with the uncertainty of determining what is valid using epistemology as opposed to using a kind of more face value morality. But I think that even if the everyday person finds that difficult to do, or you can't expect people to do it when they're panicking in the moment, I think that for the purpose of a philosophical discussion or a legal discussion or any kind of academic debate, it's our duty to think of the epistemology in that manner.
Right. So I don't think that it's going to be a matter of something being too hard. I think for most people, the question is of whether it's right to suspend our moral obligations in the face of disasters. So, in the case of an obligation like do not kill, I think that that's a pretty fundamental rule. And I don't think that it's morally acceptable to throw a rule like that to the side just because you have the chance to save more people by doing it.
But we do all the time. The idea that we should not kill
Could
is
you,
implied in situations, but for
so
example, in the
just so
case
clear,
of sorry, yep.
yeah, just to clarify, I'm talking about killing innocent people. I don't
Okay, well,
actually
even if
know
it is
of situations where we
okay.
accept killing innocent people in these situations. Like, for example, I work as an EMT most of the time, and let's say that I have just to come up with a weird situation. Let's say that I have a patient in my ambulance. It's not considered acceptable just because I have this. Just because I have somebody's life in my hands, it's not acceptable for me to like run over somebody else or like, like it's not even really okay for me to like break traffic laws and risk other people's lives because society doesn't allow us to make exceptions like that.
I recognize that society doesn't allow you to make that exception, but I am of the position that, and I believe if you again look at the original basis for that sort of conclusion, you're likely to understand that it is because you can't trust people to decide themselves when something meant to be an exception, when it shouldn't be an exception, or when you can't trust people to not abuse their ability to make that exception. And this is more poignant when you look at the case of the police or the military. It's these are cases where people have power. They're meant to be using power for justice, but they can use it for whatever they like, and occasionally they do. And
Right.
that's where the issue is.
But
It's
so
not that.
so Cam, so when you have this rule of moving over to like act utilitarian moral calculus in disaster type situations, right there, you're already going to be opening up room for all that kind of abuse that we're trying to prevent
I agree.
by having rules in the first place.
I agree.
So for that reason,
And
I think that even if, oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I think that we need to decide whether we are trying to talk about this from a philosophical lens or from the lens of prescribing that people should do this in everyday life, or decide when it is or isn't time to do this in everyday life. Because again, in the real world, there's always the knock-on effects, and people abusing the idea of their ability to do this is one of those. But I think
So,
from a philosophical perspective, from an epistemological perspective, it is correct to say that in that case, it is our goal to save as many people as possible and deal with the aftermath later using the abilities of as many people as possible. If you change the scale to be you can save 1/5 of the entire world's population versus, by pressing a button, or you can decide that 4/5 should survive. That's when you really start looking at the odds, because in that case, what you've done is you've wiped 4/5 of all humans, and the ones with the skills to deal with the aftermath, the ones with the ability to decide whether it was right or wrong in the most effective way or discuss it, are likely to be lost. At least the people who would be most interested in doing that. And that's sort of the crux of my argument, is that eventually you do have to draw a line in the sand and say morality is a means to preserving human life. It's not something we should sacrifice human lives to, because that is, it's harmful to us.
okay. So you were talking about the difference between like a philosophical conversation and a practical conversation. What I want to push back on is that I think the purpose of these sort of philosophical musings is to let us reason about what we should be doing in the real world. I think it's a big mistake to try to separate the two, because what you have then is basically it's almost like playing like Dungeons and Dragons, right? It has no relevance to the real world, and so that's why I think even if you want to talk, and I think it's okay to talk about moral systems that only apply in sort of like fantasy scenarios, I think that insofar as we're discussing moral principles that are meant to apply in the real world, we do want them to be recommendations for actual life.
I understand, but I need to reiterate what I said before, which is that philosophy's goals are twofold. Firstly, to dictate what we should do in real life. That's part of it. But second is the epistemological lens. Now, what I need to point out is that in the real world, decisions in which a huge number of people's lives are at stake or weighed against the lives of others are usually made executively, they're usually made democratically, and they're usually made involving the input of the people who are best at discussing this sort of thing. And that is why it is our duty to preserve the underlying logic behind it, because in those cases, in those extreme cases, not in the case of your average Joe seeing the trolley problem play out before his eyes, sometimes it is better to use act utilitarianism. Sometimes that would produce the best knock-on effect. Again, the case of 4/5 of the human world being at stake would be one of those. Say there's a new disease or some kind of parasite, that would spread. I believe that what most governments in the world would do is they would rather kill 1/5 of their population than let 4/5 of their population die.
Okay. So one thing I'm a little bit confused about, could you elaborate on what you mean when you say the epistemological basis for morality?
So epistemology is obviously the study of why things are true, as opposed to, if you look at in science, we have a system of what we consider true in science, sort of degrees of significance, and whether to accept or reject hypotheses. Epistemology is how we determine what should be considered significant or what should be considered
So when you say the epistemological basis for, oh yeah, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, so when we say the epistemological basis for morality, what we're saying is, okay, so we've decided that it's wrong to kill. We've decided that, that, and the other legally in a secular society, which I believe we do live in. Because I think involving religion in this would just make it 1,000 times more complicated. But in a secular society, we do determine what is moral based on an epistemology, based on the original group of people who sat together and said, okay, well, if people do that, this will probably happen, and if people do this, this will probably happen. So what's the best thing to do? That's how we got the basis of our morality in the first place.
Right. But so the thing is that we have had that conversation, and as far as I know, the result, the moral philosophy that our society abides by is that you can't kill one person to save another. Right. That is. So even on the epistemological basis that you're putting forward,
yes,
you're not gonna want to kill one person to save five.
I think that according to the original epistemology, obviously this is difficult to say because the people originally involved, they've left writings behind, but they haven't left a sort of a case of, exceptions, a list of exceptions. It is still our duty, because we are no less than them, to preserve the logic of the epistemology and be able to determine why and when exceptions should be made, because otherwise our society will never progress, And I think that is what people do. This is why there are legal cases. This is why, because if we just needed someone to sit and do everything by the book with no independent consideration, judges wouldn't need training. You just need an honest fellow to sit up there. It's not the case. We do preserve our ability to change these ideals, to amend laws, to amend what we consider moral, because we are no less competent than people who originally set out those rules.
So I think you have it exactly backwards. I think that the reason why judges do need the amount of training and experience that they do is because we expect them to interpret a complex system of laws and make decisions based not on their individual judgment of what feels right, but based on the law that we've agreed upon beforehand.
I believe that is it's something of a truth, but the existence of lawyers, of juries, juries are untrained people, exist for that for the purpose that I described, which is preserving the epistemology. If not that, and I do believe that is an example, but even if it weren't, at the very least, philosophy as a field exists to preserve that epistemology. Because if not that, then it's simply not preserved, and we could be misunderstanding it forever,
Okay. So I'm still not quite clear on what you mean when you talk about the epistemology of morality. Because earlier it seemed like you were describing some kind of a social contract. But if the epistemology of morality is a social contract, then it's just going to count in favor of the agreed upon rules in our social contract, one of which is going to be do not kill.
I understand. It seems like you're not familiar with the concept, and I apologize if I've explained it poorly. But the idea is that epistemology is the logic that the people used when they formed the social contract. And so if the social contract were ever to be amended, it should be according to a similar logic with amendments made therein. And that is why it's important for us to understand the logic. And that is what the epistemology is.
Okay. So I think that at this point, it seems like the debate has run its course. I think I've said just about every point that I want to make. Would you like to go ahead and go to closing statements?
Yeah, sure. You should go first.
Okay. So to reiterate my points during the debate, I think that it's a big mistake to view moral decisions through an entirely isolated lens, or to talk about these kinds of situations entirely in a vacuum. I think that when we talk about what the moral course of action is, I don't believe that that's able to be separated from the recommendations that we have, the rules that we think that people should live by in ordinary life. Even if you have a moral system that's designed to be applicable only in these sort of niche these sort of like niche philosophical situations, which that's what I think that act utilitarianism fundamentally is. I don't see any reason why discussing things through those lenses would ever be productive, because it's unable to be applied to the real world. I think that in the real world, it's monstrous almost to take the lives of others into our own hands. It's not a right that we give to hardly anybody. And it's not something that I think we should. I think that in the real world, for example, even people who call themselves utilitarians, if they were actually in the real world put in front of a switch like that, I don't think that very many people would flip the switch. And I don't think that they should. Because the respect that we have for the respect that we have for laws, the respect that we have for agreed upon code of the respect that we have for the agreed upon code of conduct in our society is too great. And that'll conclude my closing statement.
Thank you. Now I'll move on to mine. I believe that in the context of a philosophical discussion with the effect that it would have on our day-to-day life in mind, there should be exceptions to rule utilitarianism, precisely because it is not necessarily monstrous for us to consider what should be done with humans' lives or have them in our hands. It's too much power for one person to handle on their own. But even though it is something of a vulgar topic, it's something that we democratically need to determine. That is how our society was founded. It was a group of people who came together and decided what should and shouldn't be moral. And I believe it is still our duty today to do such things. And I think in the case of a situation in which the system that we have is resulting in the death of a greater number of people than is necessary, that is the time to make such an amendment. I don't believe necessarily that on a basic level everyone should be given executive power to decide what to do in the trolley situation, but I do believe that when taking the philosophical implications of the trolley statement to the fullest, it is important for us to preserve our ability to make a decision to save as many humans as possible. And I believe that, for example, in the case of a disease, this is what governments would resort to doing. And that will conclude my